Well, the portal gives and the portal takes. And after several weeks of taking, the portal did a little bit of giving back as Pitt landed 4 players out of the transfer portal over the weekend. I had to look down at my sheet to make sure of how many it actually was. A big haul out of a big official visit weekend. We're breaking it all down on the Monday edition of the Morning Pitt right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, it's Monday. It's the Morning Pitt. It's youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com, the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet. Football, basketball, recruiting. You find it all at Panther-Lair.com and message boards to talk to other Pitt fans. All day, every day, Panther-Lair.com is the website where Pitt fans are hanging out and talking about everything going on in the world of Pitt sports. It's all there. It's the best online community of Pitt fans that you're going to find. We have a lot of the news there, and no matter where the news breaks, Pitt fans go to the message boards at Panther-Lair.com to talk about it. Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com if you want to talk to other Pitt fans. And then, of course, our YouTube channel right here, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. It is the place we put all of our video content, these live morning Pitt videos. These daily Morning Pitt videos every day of the week. Our weekly live show, Monday through Friday. Wow, I'm getting it all mixed up. Should you just start that over again? The Morning Pitt videos that we do every day of the week, Monday through Friday. The live show that we do every Wednesday night. Although we're not going to be able to do it Wednesday night this week because Pitt plays a basketball game on Wednesday night. So we'll either do it, I haven't decided yet, either tomorrow night or Thursday night we'll do the live show. I'm not sure what makes more sense. I mean, I think it might be better to do a live show after signing day as opposed to during signing day. We'll do some live shows during signing day. I think we'll see. Yeah, let's tentatively plan on doing it Thursday night. How about that? We just made that decision right here on the Morning Pitt. We'll do the live show on Thursday night at 8 o'clock, so you can tune in for that. It's always something to look forward to. And then we have post-game press conferences and midweek video interviews and all kinds of stuff. All right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So if you manage to get through me fumbling around with the things that we actually do on this YouTube channel, I appreciate it. You should like this video and subscribe. Subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com and you won't miss any of our Pitt video content. Of course, you didn't miss any of the news and coverage from the weekend. If you were tuned in to Panther-Lair.com all weekend, starting with Friday, Pitt had 12 official visitors on campus, 2 high school prospects, and 10 transfers. Out of that group, one of the high school kids is already committed. That's Julian Duggar, the Penn Hills quarterback. The other one, Jaja Boyd, a defensive back from Philadelphia, formerly committed to James Madison. He's looking at Pitt, obviously, in Indiana, where the James Madison coaching staff is now coaching. They're with the Hoosiers, Kurt Signetti and those guys. Although not Jared Holley, the defensive backs coach. He didn't make the move from JMU to Indiana. But either way, Boyd is going to announce his commitment today. We'll see what he ends up picking. I'm guessing Indiana, but we'll see. But really, a lot of the emphasis, a lot of the focus was on the transfers. 10 transfers in town. By the time they left, 4 of them had announced their commitments to Pitt. And this is really where the focus is, because after a couple weeks of Pitt losing guys to the transfer portal, and we saw a lot of guys go into the portal, we saw a couple guys come back out of the portal, and we saw Pitt get some portal commitments last weekend with Upa, the Yukon long snapper. And actually, our friend Jerry DePaula sent us a pronunciation on Upa's full name, and I apologize, Jerry. I should have listened to that before I recorded this so I could say it properly. But Upa, the long snapper from Yukon, committed, and then Tamon Lynham, the cornerback from Nebraska, also committed last weekend. And then this weekend, Pitt got 4 commitments out of the portal. And I think what you see is really addressing some of the big needs. And some of the big needs were addressed right off the bat here with a couple of these commitments from this past weekend, like Nate Matlock, a defensive end from Kansas State, a 6'5", 245-pound guy who was in the recruiting class of 2020, which I think should give him 2 more years of eligibility, but he says he's only got 1. We'll have to try and lock that down. He says the Pitt coaches even told him he only has 1 year of eligibility left. We'll have to see what that actually looks like. But Matlock played, over the last 3 years. In total, over the last 3 years, had 9.5 sacks and 16 tackles for loss. That's not a lot of production, right? You might be sitting back and saying, you want me to get excited about a D end who in the last 3 years had 9.5 tackle. Bleh. A D end who in the last 3 years had 9.5 sacks and 16 tackles for loss. Excuse me, that's not very encouraging. And you're right. If there was a defensive end in Pitt's system who over the course of 3 years had 9.5 sacks and 16 tackles for loss, I'd say, well, that's not a whole lot of production. But Kansas State doesn't play Pitt's system. As a matter of fact, they play a very different system, and a very different system that has very different demands for its defensive ends. It's a three-man front. It's a 3-3-5 defense, an odd-man front. And in those three-man fronts, and we should all know this, if you grew up watching the Steelers, if you've watched the Steelers over the past 25, 30 years, you should understand that the role of a defensive end in those three-man fronts, those odd-man fronts, is very different. Think about a guy like Aaron Smith, right? Or Cameron Hayward or some of these. I mean, they're not producing. The sacks are being made by the edge rushers, the pass rushers coming off the edge. And that's not how the defensive ends are used in those three-man fronts. And that's not how Nate Matlock was used. And that's not how he wanted to be used anymore. He wanted to be used in a four-man front, a 4-3 defense where the edge rushers, the defensive ends, can serve as pass rushers, get off the edge, get around the tackle, and get into the backfield and make plays. That's what Nate Matlock wants to do. And that's what he's going to have an opportunity to do at Pitt. Now, incidentally, when I read those stats, 9.5 sacks and 16 tackles for loss over the last 3 years, this past season, he actually had 4 sacks and 7.5 tackles for loss. And again, he's playing in that three-man front, so it's not exactly a productive position. But he put up those numbers, 4 sacks, 7.5 tackles for loss. And that actually, if he was on Pitt's roster with those numbers, he would have been third in each category, sacks and tackles for loss. I think he would have been tied with Deion Hayes for sacks. For as much as we talk about Deion Hayes, that's pretty much the same amount playing in a 4-3 defense that this kid, Nate Matlock, had playing in a 3-3-5. And so I think the potential is there. Again, a 6'5", 245-pound guy. He seems physically like he's built more to play in this sort of defensive scheme. Charlie Partridge likes him a lot to play in this sort of defensive scheme. And I think overall, he looks like he'll be a good fit for Pitt's defense. And I think we often are fond of saying that if it's good enough for Charlie Partridge, it's good enough for the rest of us. And I think that's the case. This looks like this one's good enough for Charlie Partridge. Partridge prioritized him. Partridge went down and had an in-home visit with him. And obviously got him on campus and got a commitment. And Charlie Partridge was pretty excited, I think, about his whole weekend. As you could tell from his tweets throughout the weekend, he was he had a lot of tweets going out there. And most of them were pretty excited and encouraging tweets. And I think when he's landing guys like this and some of the other guys we're going to talk about, you can understand why. So that was one commitment that came in. I don't know order. I'm not going to say, well, this guy was first, this guy was second. I guess we have the order of the, in which they announced their commitments, but I'm not going to talk about it in that order. I want to talk about it in a different order. And this is the way we're going. We're talking about the needs. And defensive end was a need, particularly after the transfer of Sam Okunlola. You knew you were losing some guys. A little bit surprised that Nate Temple decided to come back, but then really kind of stung to lose Sam Okunlola, who was probably their best pass rusher defensive end last season, most productive pass rusher defensive end last season. So they needed to refill there a little bit, particularly when you look at what the depth is going to be for 2024. And so Matlock, an experienced player, a veteran player, he's now, he'll be a fifth-year player in 2024. So an older guy who should be able to come in and at the very least be part of the rotation, and potentially even be, starting opposite day on Hayes, depending on who emerges at defensive end. And then they got another big one. Former 4-star prospect, Nick James, defensive tackle from Indiana. And Nick James was at IMG Academy, a 4-star prospect there, number 16 defensive tackle in the recruiting class of 2022, played 2 seasons at Indiana, redshirted his first year after playing in just 4 games, played in all 12 games this past season, only had 4 tackles, but one of them was a sack. So, hey, if you get sacks on 25% of your tackles, I'd say that's pretty good. low production, but limited snaps, played less than 20 snaps in every game. Was working his way into the rotation. But again, a guy who was highly rated coming out of high school. And we know how much Pitt needs defensive tackles. We've talked a lot about how much Pitt needs defensive tackles. When you look at the 3 sixth-year seniors being done, Devin Danielson and Tyler Bentley and David Green, and then DeAndre Jules opting to transfer, and he ended up at South Carolina, the depth is pretty much wiped out at defensive tackle, where you're down to like returning guys, Elliott Donald, Sean Fitzsimmons, and Isaiah Neal. Isaiah Neal played 1 snap last season, although I think he's going to be really, really good at Pitt. He has no experience. Sean Fitzsimmons limited snaps last year in what was supposed to be his breakout season, but he got hurt. And then Elliott Donald still looking for a way to get on the field consistently and produce. And so they needed to add something to this group. They have, a couple defensive tackles in the class. We'll see what they end up with on signing day. And they could have an offensive lineman that moves to defensive tackle or something along those lines. But they needed and need transfers in the interior defensive line this offseason. And we talked a lot about this, about how dire the need is there. And when you talk about the priorities and the positions where you most need the help or you need the most help, defensive tackle is right there at the top, probably number one. There was a point during the season where I thought cornerback would be number one as far as the transfer needs, but as things shook out by the end of the year, the defensive tackle vaulted to the top spot and is the most needed position in the transfer portal. And here they got a guy who was a former 4-star prospect, the number 16 defensive tackle in the country, just 2 years ago, coming out of a powerhouse program in IMG Academy, went to Indiana for 2 years, and comes to Pitt with the potential to play at least 3 more seasons. He'll be here as a redshirt sophomore in 2024, and it'll fit in. He'll fit right into Pitt's defense, and probably be in the rotation. I would think in 2024. So that's a huge score. Sorry, I'm getting text messages. It's that time of year when there's always text messages floating in. I got a little distracted by that one. It might be something I have to put on the message boards at some point here during the day on Monday. We'll see. But they absolutely needed defensive tackles. And here they got a guy with a pretty high pedigree who looks like he'll be pretty good, and we'll see how he fits. I guess my only hesitation, or the only reason I'm sort of like, well, we'll see how he didn't do much at Indiana. He didn't play a ton at Indiana, but he's a young guy, still developing. And I think by this point now, as a redshirt sophomore, you expect him to be a contributor. And the reality is, it's as wide open at defensive tackle as it is at any other position. It really is. And so he'll have an opportunity to play. And play early and play a lot, with Donald, Fitzsimmons, Neal, any freshmen, and any other transfers they might bring in at defensive tackle. So, I start with those two guys, and there's 2 more transfers who committed over the weekend. We'll talk about them in a second, but I start with those 2 guys, Nate Matlock, the defensive end, and Nick James, the defensive tackle, along with Tamon Lynham, the cornerback from Nebraska. And I say, look, those were the 3 biggest positions where Pitt needed to fill out the roster from the transfer portal. And I know you say, oh, but dude, the offense sucked. They needed a bunch of offensive guys. Yes and no. One of the biggest changes was already made there, where they changed offensive coordinators and set the offense in a new direction. I think there are things they need to do on the offensive side of the ball. I think there are things they will do on the offensive side of the ball. They had an offensive line transfer on campus this past weekend. They had a tight end. They had a receiver. They had a running back. I think they're also going to work on getting a quarterback. So they're making efforts on that side of the ball. But if you ask me to rank the 3 positions, the top 3 spots where they needed the most help out of the transfer portal this offseason, I would have said probably in this order: defensive tackle, defensive end, cornerback. It would have been a point where I would have said defensive tackle, cornerback, defensive end, but then Sam Okunlola transferred and the numbers got thinner at defensive end, so I had to flip those 2 around. Those 3 positions have all been addressed, maybe not to completion, but addressed already in the transfer portal in this offseason. And so kudos to the Pitt staff on getting 3 guys that I think have high ceilings. They come from Power 5 programs, and I think these are the kind of shots to take. You know what I mean? These are the kind of guys to go after and try to find. And so that's what I think that's a pretty good start. And I think they'll get more. I don't think they're done, particularly on the defensive line. They might be set with corners. They might feel like they're okay with the guys they have coming back, plus line them. I think on the defensive line, they'll get at least one more defensive end. I think they could probably use another defensive tackle unless they're going to move one of the ends inside or, something like that. But I think, this is a good first step at each of those spots, in the portal this offseason. Of course, the other two guys they got this weekend are a couple of Western Carolina skill position players. We talked about these guys last week a little bit. Sincere Lee, the wide receiver, Desmond Reed, the running back. I mean, these were the two top producing guys for Western Carolina last year. I think they combined for something like 21 touchdowns out of the 50-some that Western Carolina scored. Desmond Reed, the running back, was the only player in the Southern Conference to average more than 100 rushing yards per game. He was also second in the conference in rushing yards and second in rushing touchdowns, just despite only playing in 8 games. And Sincere Lee was, I think, top 7 in pretty much every receiving category: receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns. Even though he was like 5th or 7th in receptions and receiving yards, I think he was 2nd in receiving touchdowns. Just a remarkably productive receiver playing in Cade Bell's offense. And I know it because I saw all the replies on Twitter. I knew before I even saw the replies on Twitter, I knew I was going to be seeing those replies on Twitter. I know some of the initial reaction here. Well, great. Well, good. What are you trying to build an FCS team here? Let's see how they do against the ACC. Yeah, let's see how they do against the ACC. I don't know if it's going to translate or not. I don't. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, man, Desmond Reed's going to go run for 1,500 yards in the ACC. I don't know. I'm not going to tell you that Sincere Lee is going to catch 70 passes for 1,200 yards in the ACC. I don't know. What I do know is, number one, it never hurts to add extra skill guys if they have speed, and these two guys look like they've got speed. Number two, and perhaps more importantly, if you're Pat Narduzzi and you trust Cade Bell to run the offense, and you feel like Cade Bell is going to help run a really good offense at Pitt, and you trust his, trust everything. I mean, from scheme, game planning, play calling to player evaluation. And Cade Bell tells you, look, I had these two guys at Western Carolina. They can play at this level. We had a steal. It was a steal for us to get these guys. They can absolutely play at this level, and these are the kind of guys, and perhaps more importantly, these are the kind of guys who fit in my offense. These are the kind of guys who do what I want to have happen. You know what I mean? Who get it done for me. And so if you're Pat Narduzzi and you trusted Cade Bell enough to hire him, and he comes to you and he says all those things, well, then you trust his evaluations and you bring these guys in. Overall, I feel okay with Pitt's running back room, with Rodney Hammond and Derek Davis and Montravius Lloyd and then Jules Goff coming in. Overall, I feel okay with Pitt's receiver room with Kanate Mumfield and Dejon Reynolds and Kenny Johnson and the other 3 freshmen who redshirted this year, plus Cameron Montero coming in. I feel okay with both of those groups. I don't have an issue whatsoever with adding to both of those groups. And you've got 2 guys who have been really productive and really successful playing in the offense that Pitt is going to be using, at least some elements of it, this season. So a lot of that sort of lines up for me. I'm not going to sit here and predict what I think Reed and Lee will do in the ACC, but I get why you took them, and I don't think it's the worst idea. And these guys both have a couple more years of eligibility left, so I think it's a pretty solid move. I think it's pretty solid to grab those guys. And those guys, obviously, Reed and Lee are obviously very excited for the opportunity to play at the Power 5 level, play in the ACC, and they'll create some good competition, I think, in the running back room and the receiver room. So you got a D end, a D tackle, a corner, a receiver, a running back, and a long snapper. 6 guys out of the transfer portal so far. 4 of them really filling needs and openings. Line him at cornerback and Matlock at defensive end and James at defensive tackle and Upa, the long snapper. I mean, that's a need. After Byron Floyd left and went into the transfer portal and ended up at Buffalo, Pitt had a need at long snapper. And if they didn't feel like they had a good option on the roster, they went out and got somebody who has experience doing it for a full season, which Upa has. And then they added a couple of luxury guys who might be able to make their offense a little bit better. And I think that's probably the way you navigate the transfer portal. You fill needs and you find guys who can maybe top you off a little bit. Guys who can be luxury guys who can maybe make you a little bit better. And I think that's what Pitt has done really over the last 2 weeks of the transfer portal. And I think that's what they did, particularly this past weekend. And I think they'll add more guys out of this past weekend. I told you there were 10 transfers that were here over the weekend. 4 of them have committed. That leaves the other 6. I wouldn't be surprised if at least 3 of those remaining 6 end up committing to Pitt. And who knows, maybe more. I think they're in good shape. I think they're in good shape with some of these transfers that they had over the weekend. And I think if they land those guys, it's going to further solidify the roster heading in to 2024. I'm guessing it's going to be an interesting couple of days here over the next over the next 48 hours heading into signing day. That's Wednesday. Today's Monday, so things are going to get wild and interesting and change plenty of times over the next 48 hours. I hope you're ready for it. Hope you're buckled up and ready to go. Of course, we've got plenty to talk about this week on the Morning Pit. We'll be talking basketball. We'll be continuing to talk transfers and recruiting and all those things heading into signing day. Pitt's got the non-conference finale on Wednesday night, so we've got that to talk about. I mean, we got all kinds of things to talk about here on the Morning Pit, so make sure you stay tuned in. Like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We'll have our live show, our live Panther-Lair show on Thursday night. We'll have probably some live streams throughout the day on Wednesday just to get some signing day talk. I mean, we're going to have stuff all over the place. You don't want to miss any of it, so subscribe. youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, and then head over to the website, Panther-Lair.com. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Hope you had a great weekend, and I hope you're ready for the ride to signing day, the run-up coming here over the next 2 days. I know I am, and I'm sure you'll be here with us. So thanks for watching the video. We appreciate it. Hope you have a great Monday, and we will talk to you tomorrow for the Morning Pit right here, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.